All right, so we'll say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsor for the month of Shvat, Mrs. Selma Woolf, for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drushos this month. With immense gratitude for the refuos from Hashem and the merit of a refuah for all of those in need, in the zchus of our brave soldiers and in the zchus of the return of each of our hostages. Our week of learning sponsor, Ken and Dena Lieblich, in the merit of the safe return of their son, Aharon, Daniel, Ben Proumo, דינה, and his entire pluga who are currently serving in Gaza. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu watch over them, allow them to be successful in their missions, and return them to their families b'shalom and b'karov. And of course, we dedicate all of Maseches Baba Kama, the Ilui Nishmas, Master Sergeant Eliyahu Harush, Hashem Yikom Damo. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, his Neshama will have an aliya and the family in a Neshama. With that, let us begin. Today's daf is Pei Tes 89, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Pei Ches Amud Beis. So we actually have a lot to do today. So we left off in the middle of a really interesting sugya, Maseches Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So specifically with the following case. The case we were dealing with was the following situation. Machar haben b'chayi ha'av, umeis haben b'chayi ha'av. So here was the case that the son went ahead and sold property during the lifetime of his father. So remember again, building on the case before it, a father, we'll call him Yaakov, made a gift to his son Reuven. And the gift went like this, right? This field is yours, me hayom ula'achar mosi. From today and after my death. So at this point again, so now the father went ahead and gave over the son the rights to the field. He gave him over the title to the field, but the father retains usage of the field until after his death. Then once he dies, effectively the gift or the transaction becomes retroactively valid to the date that the father transferred it over to the son. So what's the shaila? So beforehand we were talking about the idea that really neither party could fully sell it, right? So on one hand, the son has title, but he doesn't have usage. The father has usage, but he doesn't have title. So now we're dealing with the following situation. So now, in general, the halacha is like this. If the father goes ahead and sells it, the sale is valid in that the father could sell peros, right? If the son sells it, the sale is invalid. When does it become valid? When the father dies. Then the Gemara brought up a little bit of a wrinkle in the case. So let's say the same situation, same case, right? I'm giving you this field, mehayom ula'achar mosi. What happens? Son sells the field, but now what occurs? Son predeceases the father. So the shaila now is, when the father ultimately dies, is the son's transaction valid or not? So just to kind of attach names over here, right? So Yaakov says to his son Reuven, right, this field is yours from today until I die. Okay, so what or when I die. So then what happens? So the son, Reuven, goes ahead and sells the field to Shimon. Now Reuven goes ahead and predeceases his father. So the shaila now is, when Yaakov ultimately dies, does the field go to Shimon or not? That's the machlokes. So again, so we ended off yesterday, we did the position of Rabbi Yochanan, right? Rabbi Yochanan said, lo kana lokeach. Ultimately, again, the sale is not really a valid sale. What was Rabbi Yochanan's logic? Rabbi Yochanan holds, alma kasavar kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf. Rabbi Yochanan holds that he who has usage, he who has peros, really is the owner. And therefore, again, what Rabbi Yochanan essentially holds is that when Reuven, the son, went ahead and sold the field, that was really an ineffective sale. The only way a sale like that could work is if Yaakov, the father, died, then Reuven inherits. Then again, Reuven has the ability to go ahead and sell it. But Lamaisa, during the father's lifetime, when the father has kinyan peros is kekinyan aguf. He who has usage is essentially the owner, and therefore Reuven really had no ability to transact with Shimon. Reuven's sale is really ineffective, coupled by the fact that Reuven predeceased his father. Nothing really to talk about. That's Rabbi Yochanan. So we left off with Rabbi Shimon Lakish. Rabbi Shimon Lakish Omer, it's about a lot. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22. About 25 lines up from the bottom. Reish Lakish, on the other hand, says, Kana lokeach. Reish Lakish says, no, it works. It works that in this case, when again, Yaakov the father is giving over the field to his son Ruvain, Mehayom ula'achar mosi, from today and after my death, then Ruvain goes ahead and sells the field to Shimon. Then Ruvain predeceases his father, that upon the death of Yaakov the father, the field actually goes to Shimon. So the Gemara says as follows. Shmuel says it works. Why does it work? Ki katani machar haben ein lokeach ad shiyamos sa'av. So I was like, because when we said before that halacha l'maisa, when the son goes ahead and sells the field, so the transaction, lokeach, the purchaser, doesn't have anything until the father dies. But we see from here, ki mayis av mihas isle lokeach. When the father does die, right? When Yaakov does die, ultimately Shimon the purchaser does acquire the field. Lo shna meis haben b'chaye ha'av. So it doesn't make a difference if the son predeceased the father, the asuli yadei debein, right? Veloshna meis haben. Sorry, that's just the opposite. Loshna meis haben b'chaye ha'av the asuli yadei debein. Veloshna meis haben b'chaye ha'av the lo asuli yadei debein the kana lokeach. So we'll say, Reish Lakish says, it really makes no difference whether or not son predeceased the father or father predeceases the son. At the end of the day, the transaction works. Why? Alma kasavar, because Reish Lakish holds kinyan peros, lav kekinyan haguftami. He holds that right of usage, ultimately again, is not tantamount, is not the equivalent to ownership, and therefore v'chi kazobin, and ultimately, again, therefore, when Reuven goes ahead and sells the field, he effectively is selling his own field. And I will say, so let's just take a step back for a moment and just frame this again. So here's what we have, right? Let's just frame the case once more. Now we have both positions, right? We have Yaakov the father. Yaakov father has a field. Yaakov father gives the field over to his son Reuven, but he gives it over to him in an interesting way. He says, "This field is this field is yours. Mehayom ula'achar mosi, from today and after my death." Now, what does a gift like that mean? Effectively, what does that mean? What that means is that Yaakov is giving over title, but retaining usage. Right? He's giving over title, but he's retaining peros. He's retaining peros. Fine. So now what happens? So we'll say, so now, before we even get into the rest of the case, there's now a fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. What's the fundamental machlokes? Right now, who owns this field? Who is the owner of this field? So Rabbi Yochanan would say that ultimately, again, the father is still the owner of the field. Why? Kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf. Whoever has usage is the owner. Reish Lakish says, no, right? It's about title. And therefore, kinyan peros lat kinyan aguf, we say father has usage, but son is the actual owner. So we'll say, that is our machlokes. It happens to be, the way the machlokes is framed is how, in a case where now after this whole transaction occurred, so Reuven the son goes ahead and sells the field to Shimon. Now, everyone agrees that the sale is not really going to be effective until when? Until Father Yaakov dies. Right until Father Yaakov dies, because Father Yaakov still has usage. So again, in a typical case where Father Yaakov dies, then the transaction will be valid. The wrinkle over here is what happens. The son, Reuven, predeceased his father. So now the shaila is, when Yaakov the father dies, does the field go to Levi or Shimon or not? Shimon or not? So Rabbi Yochanan will say, no, it doesn't. Why doesn't it? Because the sale was never good. Why was the sale never good? Kinyan peros, kinyan aguf. Because ultimately, again, Reuven his son sold something that wasn't his. He sold a field that really belonged to his father. It belonged to his father. Reish Lakish will say, it absolutely works. Why? Kinyan peros, lav kinyan aguf. At the end of the day, Reuven the son was really the owner. Therefore, he has the right to go ahead and sell it. Granted, the sale doesn't vest, so to speak, until Yaakov the father dies. But Lamaisa, the sale works, and therefore, upon the death of Father Yaakov, even though Reuven, his son, already predeceased him, the field ultimately will go to Shimon. That's our machlokas. To which the Gemara says, Va'anan. Now, we'll say, remember, how did we get into all of this? Right? How did we get here? If you remember again, in yesterday's daf, on the end of Amud Aleph, we had the interesting case of the father of Rav Shmuel, right, who got remarried to a man by the name of Rabbi Abba. During her marriage, what did she do? She gave her property to her son, Rav Shmuel. So now both say, upon her death, her son was confirming that he indeed was the owner of the property, and that the husband, Rabbi Abba, didn't go ahead and inherit her. So essentially now, this case is a parallel case. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, a husband during his wife's lifetime has peros, has usage. So essentially what ended up happening was the mother of Rav Shmuel gave away property, gifted property to another person that her husband had usage of. So the shaila is such a conveyance effective or not? What does that depend on? This same machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Do we say kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf or not? So do you say like Rabbi Yochanan that again, if you hold kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf, that means the husband, Rabbi Abba, was the owner. If the husband, Rabbi Abba, was the owner, then his wife had absolutely no right to convey the property to her son. That's Rabbi Yochanan. If on the other hand, if you hold kinyan peros lat ke kinyan aguf, usage is not ownership. She had ownership. She had every right to give it over to her son. So that's what I will say. So that's where all of this. That's where all of this is coming up. So remember again, Rabbi Yirmiyah, going back to that previous case, Rabbi Yirmiyah was the one who confirmed that halacha l'maisa, the son Rav Shmuel, had every right to retain that property. So I will say, so now let's bring this full circle. Va'anon. So I will say, so now va'anon hashta ben Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba ben Rabbi Huda bar Rabbi Shimon. Ben Rabbi Huda, and I will say we hold that both Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Huda. Now remember again, Rabbi Yirmiyah was the one who confirmed that the son of Shmuel was the rightful owner of the property. Rabbi Huda disagreed. So the Gemara said so now we hold that both according to Rabbi Yirmiyah and both according to Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish svir lahu. Both of them hold like Reish Lakish. And what does Reish Lakish hold? Kinyan peros, lav ke kinyan aguf. That's how they both hold. The Ka'amr Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Rabbi Abba says as follows: if you hold that kinyan peros, right, that peros is like ownership, kimayis av umayis haben b'chaye ha'av amayis le'lelokeach. Rabbi say if that's the case, that the father died, but the son predeceased the father. So why does the purchaser, and as we called him Shimon, why does Shimon have any rights in this property? After all, ki kazabin hai lav didi kazabin. Ultimately, again, when the son Reuven sold property, he sold property that didn't really belong to him. Elalav shmamina kinyan peros lav ke kinyan aguftami. Rather, what you have to say is the fact that the transaction works, and upon the death of the father Yaakov, ultimately purchaser does have rights in the property, does own the property. Now, what does that show you? That kinyan peros lav ke kinyan aguf, usage is not tantamount to ownership. Therefore, again, son Reuven really had rights over the property, and therefore the sale to Shimon was an effective sale. To which the Gemara says, "Hadri the kamed Rabbi Yehuda." So they brought this back to Rabbi Yehuda. Amar lahu hachi amar Shmuel. Both say first wide line. He said as follows. He said Shmuel said as follows: Zu eina doma mishnasenu. These cases are not comparable. Why not? My taima amar Rav Yosef. So the Gemara said, "Bishlama itani ipcha." Had you written the opposite case, hakosev nechasav la'aviv, so we'll say a case of where a son wrote his property to his father. So let's say you have the reverse case, right? Reuven says to his father, "This is your field, mehayom ula achar mosi, ika lemifshat minei de kinyan peres latka kinyan aguftami." Then you could extrapolate that a kinyan peres is not a kinyan aguf. Elahashta diktani hakosev nechasav libno mishum dvar the arshavu. We'll say the case of the father to the son is a different kind of case. Why is it a different kind of case? Because it will say, anyway, Reuven stands to go ahead and inherit this field, right? If the father does nothing, Reuven is going to inherit. So ultimately, again, you can't go ahead and extrapolate kinyan aperes lav kinyan aguf or kinyan aguf. Normally, Abaye says 1 second. Atu bra yaris abba lo yaris bra. But that's not necessarily true. The same way that a son inherits a father, technically speaking, a father could inherit a son if there are no other inheritors. Rather, I will say, could very well be that what's happening over here is, why would Reuven write his property over to his father? Perhaps because Reuven does not want his own children to inherit. Well, if that's the case, but you could have the same type of situation where Yaakov, the father, is writing the property over to Reuven, his son. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, he doesn't want the other children to inherit. So rather, why can you say that this case of where Yaakov, the father, is conveying ownership over to the property to his sons, why is that not comparable to our Mishnah? Mishum takanos usha. Because of the takana of usha. We'll say, so we'll say, so now, what we are suggesting over here, we'll remember again, we were trying to compare the case of the mother of Rav Shmuel, who went ahead and conveyed her property to her son during her marriage to Rabbi Abba. We tried to compare that to this case over here of what? Of where Father Yaakov conveyed ownership to a field to his son Reuven, mehayom ula achar mosi, and then halacha l'maisa, during the father's lifetime, Reuven sold it to Shimon. We were trying to compare those two cases, right? And we were trying to say that just like there's a machlokas of Yochanan and Reish Lakish, in the case of where Reuven, the son, sells it to another party, to Shimon, during the lifetime of his father, what's the machlokes there? Kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf, or lav ke kinyan aguf. So we're going to compare that same case to the case of the mother of Rav Shmuel. Because what did the mother of Rav Shmuel do? We'll say, what did she do? She took property. Let's play this out. She took property. Who owns that property? Who owns that property? She owns the property. Basha says, she owns the property, but yet her husband Rabbi Abba, has peros. So she took property that her husband has peros, but that she owns title, and she gave it to someone else, to another party. In this case, the other party was her son. Her son. So we'll say, so what was our shaila? Does that work or not? So b'pashtos, what does that depend on? Seemingly, machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Is kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf or not? Does usage represent ownership? So if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, that usage represents ownership, kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf, that means the husband, Rabbi Abba, is really the owner of the property. If he's really the owner of his property, then his wife, the mother of Rav Shmuel, has no right to give it over to her son. But if you hold, like Reish Lakish, that kinyan peros lav ke kinyan aguf, that usage is not tantamount to ownership. Therefore what? Therefore, again, mother of Rav Shmuel, wife of Rabbi Abba, she owns the property. She owns it. Okay, her husband has usage of it. I understand that. But usage is not ownership. She's the owner, and therefore she has the right to convey it over to her son. So that's what we're trying to equate it to. To which the Gemara says, can't equate it. I'll tell you why. The marriage case of where the woman brings in property and husband has usage is subject to a totally different halacha. Which halacha will say? Takanas usha. Now, what is takanas usha? Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina, Bu'usha hiskinu. In Usha, they instituted the following halacha. Ha'isha shemachra b'nichsei melog b'chaye baila umesa habal motzi miyad l'kuchos. We'll say, what's takanas usha? That if a woman, during the course of her marriage, went ahead and sold nichsei melog. And let's remember again, what's nichsei melog? Nichsei melog, back to our Ksuvas days, nichsei melog is property the woman brings into a marriage that she retains title, but husband has usage. So in Usha, they instituted the following halacha, that if a woman goes ahead, and I will say, by the way, nichsei melog, whatever appreciation or depreciation, that ultimately, again, is borne by the woman, by the wife, right? In other words, at the end of the day, she retains title, husband just has usage. So now watch this. So now in Usha, they made the following takana, that if halacha l'maisa, during the course of a marriage, a woman went ahead and sold her nichsei melog, and now she predeceases her husband has the right to go ahead and extract that nichsei melog from any purchasers upon her death. That was takonas usha. This is one of the takonas. Let me look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Usha eskinu diafagav deba amalav kekinyan aguftami." Now watch this. I will say, what is this takana predicated on? This takana predicated on the fact that normally we hold like Reish Lakish, namely kinyan peros lav kekinyan aguf. Usage is not tantamount to ownership. Nevertheless, Rashi says, "Baal benichse ishto al muha rabbanon l'shibudei mishum eva v'havi kilokeach rishon." It will say, in order to prevent animosity in a marriage. Now, what does mean animosity? It's not a good thing if a wife starts selling off her nichse malug over the course of the marriage. Why? Because again, remember, a husband has an obligation for support of his wife, and one of the ways that Chazal kind of offset that expense of support is by giving him rights of usage over her property. If she starts selling off the property, it's not good. It's not good. It creates marital animosity. How did Chazal go ahead and address that animosity? How did they address it? Ultimately, by saying, upon her death, essentially husband becomes like a first position purchaser or a first position creditor, and therefore has the right to extract that from anyone who bought it. Sefer Rabbi, the Gemara says, we're dealing, so again, even if you hold like Reish Lakish, that kinyan peros lav ke kinyan aguf, then normally we say usage is not ownership. Usage is not ownership. And therefore, really, a husband is not an owner in his wife's nichse malug. In usha, they made a takana that he is like the owner. He is like the owner. So during her lifetime, she has title, but upon her death, he effectively becomes like the owner of that property and has the ability to go ahead and extract it from any purchasers. Incredible. Therefore, it turns out that the case of the mother of Rav Shmuel, the wife of Rabbi Abba, is just governed by a totally different halacha. That's all. It's just, we're trying to compare it to the Machlokes of Yochanan Reish Lakish, and it turns out it's not comparable. It's just a different case. Am Rabbi Dibaravin. Af anan namitanin. We learn this as well. Mi'idin anubish ploni shegiris ishishto v'nasa ksuvasa. So an interesting case, Rabbi say, witnesses show up and they testify. We testify that Ruvain was married to Rachel, and that Ruvain divorced Rachel and paid her ksuva, top of paytes. V'hari hitachtav u'mishamashto. But ultimately, again, but we see that halacha l'maisa, they're living together. So what's the halacha? V'nimtzu zomin, and now it turns out that the edim are edim zomin. So the edim lied. What's the halacha? What's actually interesting? Ein omrim yishamu kol ksuvas. As well as I say, now remember again, whenever it comes to edim zomin, what's the halacha by edim zomin? Reciprocal punishment. So the shaila is, what do they have to pay in this case? Right? What do they pay? So the Gemara says, we don't make them pay the entire value of the ksuva, ella tovas hanas ksuvasa. Rather, we make them pay what we call tovas hana. Tovas hana. And I both say, rather, look at Rashi just a moment. Fari tachtov, divada neskar shaide edim achirim, ki mishtachachi hanach edim zomin havu mishalmin la kol ksuvasa, Tabau sude kula mina de kamri nasal aval hashta shema ina asida litol ksuvasa the olam shema tamus yoshana bala. Fine. So we'll say now watch this. So now the Gemara is like this. We don't make them pay the entire ksuva. Rather, what do they have to pay? Tovas hana ksuvasa. So I was ask the Gemara, what is tovas hana? Izu tovas hana ksuvasa. What does that mean? Tovas hana. Omdin kama adam roza litem biksuvasa shalzu shem nisarmela onis garsha. So let's listen to this. Essentially, Tovas Rabbi means like the technical term part of it. We'll call it like the future rights to a ksuva. Now, just to illustrate this in a totally different case, a woman could technically sell the future right of her ksuva. Now, how does that future right look? It looks like this, right? So again, Ruvain is married to Rachel. Rachel sells her ksuva. She sells her ksuva to Shimon. Now we'll say now, what is that future right represents? It represents essentially the following scenario. If I get divorced, right, Rachel gets divorced, or her husband dies, the ksuva will be worth, let's call it, 200 zuz. But there's also the possibility that what? Right? What's the possibility that what? That she predeceases her husband. If she predeceases her husband, what's the ksuva worth? Zero. So essentially you're selling a future. You're selling a future, right? A future right. So obviously what that would mean is, the only way you're selling that is how? At a discount, right? No one is paying face value for that ksuva. At most, you're going to go ahead and sell it at a discount. Right? Lesala takanas usha. That was if at the end of the day you don't hold off takanas usha, then ultimately again amayira shana baila tizabin ksuvas legamre. That wasn't. Here's what's interesting: the fact that we say that there is the possibility that the wife will die and the husband inherits her. But one second, why don't we say that if a wife sells her ksuva sold? What do you see from here? What do you see from here? You see from here that Allah Alamaisa, that when a woman dies, her husband inherits all of her property, which shows you that any sale she makes during her lifetime is not a bona fide sale. Why is it not a bona fide sale? It must mean what? Takanas usha. So as Takanas usha comes along and says that halacha lemaisa, whatever she sells, whatever property she sells over the course of the marriage, upon her death, her husband has the ability to extract those properties from any purchasers. That's Takanos usha. Incredible. That's Takanos usha. I'm Rabbi said, one second. Im amru b'nechse melug, yomru b'nechse tzon barzel. I will say one second. What does Takanos usha cover? So Bepashtas, it only covers Nichse Mulug, it doesn't cover Nichse Tzon Barzel. So both say, remember again, we've had this before. What's there saying Nichse Tzon Barzel? Nichse Mulug, a wife brings into the marriage. Essentially, she retains title. Husband has complete ownership over it. Usage over it. Now both say, now what happens in the event of death or divorce with Nichse Mulug? Whatever's left, she takes with her. Right? If this and if the property is all used up, it's all used up, nothing more to talk about. Nichse Tzon Barzel is property that a woman brings into the marriage. The property is assessed. And what happens? Husband guarantees the value of that property. So should there be divorce or death of the husband, what happens? Husband or his estate pays that value. That value is locked in. So look at Rashi. Yom b'nichse tzon barzel b'ksuvasa dahanyu nedunyo shechnisa lo b'shuma mibeis haviyah. Remember again, she's bringing in that property. That property is assessed. They goes in also b'ksuvasa. And ultimately, the value of that property is written into the ksuva. Umekambel alav chasan achrayis. And the chasan goes ahead and has complete achrayis, complete responsibility. Vim pichsu, pichsulo. And if it diminishes, he bears the depreciation. Vim osiro, if it appreciates, he gets the appreciation. And therefore, getting Gemara says, Nechseit som barzal, the chasma omdim ba'achrayis, amekabel, the shayim kein barzal, zushi kasha lios. So what's this? Now watch this. So now the Gemara says, by the way, takanas usha is really only going to cover what? Only going to cover Nichse Mulug. Because Nichse Tzon Barzel, those remain the property of the woman even after death or divorce. Husband is guaranteeing that value. Am Rabbi, Tovas. So again, therefore, both said the Gemara just points out to it, just as an aside, that halacha l'maisa, takanas usha really only applies ultimately again to Nichse Mulug. Doesn't apply to Nichse Tzon Barzel. So we'll say, it's not like we're about to veer off on a different topic. So let's just point out what we have over here. So we'll say, so what comes out over here is something very interesting, which is that halacha l'maisa, two things. So number one, it turns out that in the din, or in the case of where the mother of Rav Shmuel ended up giving him marital property, giving him Nichse Mulug. So we'll say, and then she dies. It turns out that what? Doesn't really work, that her husband, Rabbi Abba, would absolutely have the right to go ahead and extract it. Why? Because Rabbi said that's takanas usha. That's takanas usha. And takanas usha says, any nichse mulug that a woman sells over the course of her marriage, upon her death, husband has the right to extract it ultimately from purchasers. So that's that case. Just as an aside, the Gemara introduces us to the riveting machlokes, ultimately Yochanan Reish Lakish, which is kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf, or lathiking in a guf. They will say, is usage considered to be ownership or not? That's machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. We don't have to deal with halacha l'maisa of that right now, as we're still going to see that a little bit more in the future. Good. So let's go back there. Am Rabbi says, Tovas hana hoil va'asili adan nema buhu milsa. So we'll say, so Rabbi says, by the way, now that we brought up this concept of Tovas hana, let's talk about it a little bit. So we'll say, what's the case of Tovas hana? Tovas hana means the ability to sell a future. A woman sells her ksuva. What is she selling? She's selling the future right to collect her ksuva, which is based on the fact that her husband divorces or predeceases her. But if she predeceases her husband, then what? Then obviously there's no value. So now Abai says, let's talk about this a little bit. So the Gemara says, so good, so tovas hanal the isha, so tovas hanal the isha havia. So we'll say, so listen to this. Abai says, let's play this out. Right, Reuben's married to Rachel. Rachel decides to sell the future right to her ksuva. So let's say, I don't know, let's say how much is that worth? Let's say it's worth 100 zuz. So she goes over, right, she strikes a deal with Levi, and she sells it for 100 zuz. So let's say, now what's the shaila? Who gets to keep that 100 zuz? Who gets to keep the 100 zuz? So the Gemara says, so Abayi says, it's Rachel's. She gets to keep it. So because if you think that the money goes to the husband, so leimru lo edim ma'af sedinach. So I'll say, so again, I'll say, going back to the previous case, where Edim testified that she was divorced and received her ksuva, right? But in fact, they were Edim zomamin, then we really shouldn't go out and punish the Edim at all, because the Edim could say to Rachel, what did we really cause you to lose? After all, again, ma'af sedinach, even had you sold your ksuva for the tovas hana value, you wouldn't have gotten it. Bal hava shakel minach. The husband would have received that value from you. Some says no, because at the end of the day, even if the husband technically would go ahead and get the proceeds, it still benefits the woman. Why? Because when there's more money in the household, ultimately the woman benefits from it, even if she's not the one who's the owner of the money. Amar Rava said, Hilchasa tovas hanal the isha ve'in habal ochel peros. So we'll say, interestingly enough, Rava says that halacha l'maisa tovas hanal belongs to the woman. So meaning, when a woman sells the future right to her ksuva, any money that comes in as a result of that sale belongs to Rachel, the wife. Belongs to Rachel, the wife. Not only that, Rabbi said, listen, it's not only that. If she takes that money and she purchases, let's say, real estate with that money, the husband does not get peros from that land. He doesn't get peros. Rashi says, why? This is actually very interesting. Husband doesn't get peros from that. My time, what's the reason? Pero takino le rabbanon. Sorry, pero takino le rabbanon. Pero de pero lo takino le rabbanon. Why? Because we'll say, what does the husband get? Husband gets peros, right? Peros of her property. What doesn't he get? He doesn't get peros of peros. So I'll say, if you think about it over here, right? If she goes in and she sells the future right to her ksuva, right? That money is peros. If now, technically it's peros. If she now invests that in land, that's peros of peros. He doesn't get that. He doesn't get that. That type of, in other words, I would say, it's another way of saying that. What is he entitled to? He's entitled to usage of property she brings into the marriage. But halacha l'maisa, if she sells a right that is due to her, her ksuva, she sells the future right to her ksuva, and whatever. So for number one, she gets to keep the proceeds of that sale. Number two, whatever she does with it is hers and hers alone. He doesn't get peros of that. Fascinating. So we learn the following. Tanina l'takanas usha. Ha'eved va'isha pigi asan ra. So also remember again, we saw in our Mishnah that if one goes ahead and injures an eved and an isha, they're always at a disadvantage. Why? Because ha'chova bahen chayiv. Because it will say halacha l'maisa, if you injure an eved or an isha, you're chayiv. But yet ve'hem shechavlu ba'achirim pater p'turin. I will say, but if an eved or an isha injures someone else, what's the halacha? They're p'turin. I will say, remember again in the Mishnah, why are they p'turin? Why are they p'turin? Because the assumption is they have no money, right? They have no assets. V'sagdaitcha les la takanas usha. I will say, but one second. If you don't hold of takanas usha, remember again, I will say, what does takanas usha say? Takanas usha says that whatever property a woman sells, whatever nichsim a woman sells over the course of her marriage, what's halacha? What's halacha? When she dies, the husband has the right to collect that property. Which I will say, but Pashtus, what does that effectively do? What does that effectively do? That effectively shuts down her ability to sell property. Why? Because unless you're selling it at a very, very deep discount, no one's buying that property. It doesn't make any sense to buy that property because she could die tomorrow, and it turns out you spent money on a field, and now again the husband is going to come and take it from you. So I will say, now watch this. So therefore, again, if you hold off takanas usha, it makes a lot of sense that we say that a woman essentially doesn't have money to go ahead and pay for damages. However, watch this. But if you don't hold off takanas usha, then Rabbi say tizamid nichse mulug v'titin lei. Then Rabbi say she does have the ability to pay for damages. How does she have the ability to pay for damages? Let her sell off her nichse mulug. Again, Rabbi say this is if you don't hold off takanas usha. Let her sell off her nichse mulug. She now has money and she could pay off her damages. Uletamech, using that same logic. Even if you hold off takanas usha, and therefore lo matzi mizabna legamre tizabin lenichse mulug betovas hana v'titen le. So I'll say, I don't understand. There's still for her to make money. How could she go to make money? She could sell off nichse mulug betovas hana. In other words, we'll say you could still sell it, right? But how do you sell it? You're selling a future. Selling a future, she could say, listen, right, she take her nichse mulug, sell it to Shimon. And say, Shimon, look, here's the deal. I'm selling you my nichse mulug, obviously at a discount, because one of two things is going to happen. I'm going to die, in which case if I die, my husband's going to come and collect this property, right? Or, what's the other possibility? My husband dies. And if my husband predeceases me, then halacha l'maisa, my property becomes mine. So in other words, I would say, even if you hold off takanas usha, there is still a way for her to sell property and ultimately, again, essentially earn some money. Now, why do I want her to earn some money? Because this is she could pay off her damages. Ella, the less law. Rather, both say the Mishnah's case must be talking about she doesn't have any nichse mulug. Okay, she doesn't have property. So because she doesn't have property, halchanami the less law. So she doesn't have any property. Because she doesn't have any property, there's nothing to sell. Because there's nothing to sell, ultimately, again, there's no money to be earned, and therefore, again, there's no way to pay off damages. Okay. I says the Gemara v'tizabin ksuvasa b'tovas hana v'titin lei. But the Rosh said that's not true. Every woman has an asset, right? What's her asset? Her ksuva. So why don't we say that when a woman injures someone, right? Rachel's married to Ruvain, and Rachel injures Shimon. So the Mishnah said, Rachel doesn't have to pay anything now because she doesn't have any money. What do you mean she doesn't have any money? She has a ksuva. Let her sell the future right to her ksuva and use the proceeds of that sale to pay off damages to Shimon. Why can't, granted, I will say again, remember, whenever you sell a ksuva, it's always going to be what? Sold at a discount, but still she could earn something from that sale. Let her use the proceeds of that sale to go out and pay Shimon for damages. Ha money Rabbi Meir he. So we'll say, who's opinion does this reflect? It reflects Rabbi Meir of Da'amar. Asr lo li adam shiyashes ishto afidu sha'achas below ksuva. So we'll say, ultimately, again, it's Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir holds that a man is not permitted to live with his wife without a ksuva. So therefore, Rabbi say, it turns out that really a woman can't sell her ksuva, because if she sells her ksuva, halacha l'maisa, her husband cannot live with her. Now, what's the logic of that? V'taimamai kedei shelo tehei kala be'inav lahotzia. Because Rabbi say, ultimately, again, remember, I will say, this is for the woman's benefit. We don't want there to be a marriage without a ksuva. Why? Because I will say, a ksuva ultimately, again, is one of the things that makes the husband think twice about divorcing his wife. Otherwise, again, he can be very flippant in divorcing of his wife, because Lamaisa, again, it's not going to cost him. Because there is a ksuva, again, I will say, allows or prevents him from making any rash decisions. So therefore, Rabbi Meir is the opinion that holds that if a woman doesn't have a ksuva, then ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, the couple cannot live together. So therefore, again, effectively, according to Rabbi Meir, a woman really can't sell her ksuva. She can't sell her ksuva, because otherwise, again, she can't live with her husband, to which the Gemara says, but in this case, it still applies. Why? Hacha lo megarish la. Ti megarish la asu hanach tizabini. Gabul lo ksuva. So, the Gemara says, that's fine. That's fine. In other words, we'll say, even if Rachel sold her ksuva, Rabbi Meir's issue is still addressed. Why? Because in the event that Reuven were to divorce Rachel, what would happen? He would have to pay her ksuva, because now the purchaser would come to collect the ksuva. In other words, so the logic is still intact, right? Rabbi Meir says, you can't live with... Let's kind of bring this together. We're trying to figure out what the Mishnah says, that if Rachel, the wife, injures Shimon, another guy, that interaction is negative. Why? Because Shimon can't collect anything from Rachel. To which the Gemara says, why not? Just have her sell her ksuva, the future rights to her ksuva, use the proceeds of that sale to sell off damages. But it says, no, because it's to Rabbi Meir says you can't live with your wife without a ksuva. But she has a ksuva. She just sold it. And the truth is, the ksuba as the deterrent to divorce still applies. Why? Because in the event that he divorces her, while it's true that he won't have to pay her the money, but he will have to what? He will have to pay Shimon. So the financial deterrent to divorce is still intact. So why not go ahead and allow her to sell off the future right to the ksuba, use the proceeds to pay off damages? To which the Gemara says, Ella, tovas hana mili ninu. We'll say first line on the bottom. Umili lo mishtabdi. So this is interesting. Rather, the Gemara answers, tovas hana is just it's words. And words ultimately, again, don't create a shibud. To which the Gemara says, in other words, what is she going to do? She's going to she's going to go ahead and give over the future right of her ksuva to the damaged party. So what? So what? Those are words, right? And words don't create an actual financial reality. Gemara says, I don't understand. Alamalo, mili demizdabni bedinarininu. So we'll say, but it's not just words. It's not just words. It's a right. It's an entitlement. And she does have the ability to sell that right, and that right has a financial value. In other words, we'll say, she could sell that ksuva. Granted, again, it's a future, but she could sell it now, and there is money to be realized now from that sale. Elamishum de Shmuel. Rather, I will say, must reflect the view of Shmuel. Damar Shmuel, hamochesh tarchov lechavero. If someone goes in and sells a document of indebtedness to their friend, v'chazar umachlo machol, and he then turns around and forgives it, it's machol. Va'afilu yoresh machol. So we'll say, now listen to this. We'll say, so just to illustrate this, if I lend money to Ruvain, right? So now Ruvain owes me money. I take the debt, I sell it to Shimon. So I sold the debt to Shimon. Right? So now Shimon has right of collection. Watch those. I turn around and I forgive the debt to Ruvain. Right? I forgive the debt to Ruvain. So obviously not a correct thing to do. But if you did it, it works. It works. So therefore, in this case over here, I feel Yarish Mochal, Amri Zabune Zavin, Vitite Le, Vi'imachla Le Lagabe Bal, Timchale. So we'll say, so now, again, here's what's interesting about this. Therefore, the Gemara suggests, here's the problem. What's the problem over here? If Rachel sells the future right of her ksuva, so what could she technically do? Well, so what could she do after the fact? She could be machol, right? She could be machol the ksuva. She could, remember again, the ksuva is a debt. Anything that's owed to you could always be mochel. So we have to be concerned over that if she sells the future right to the husband, she could always turn around and be mochel. To which the Gemara says, fine, still understand. Let her sell it. Or as we'll say, remember, the Mishnah says that when a married woman injures someone, it's really the injured party is at a disadvantage because there is no money to be collected. To which the Gemara is just trying to show that's not true. There is money to be collected. She has the ability to sell her ksuva, and that has a value. But she could sell it and then forgive it. Fine, so let's deal with that then. Let's deal with that then. But I will say, but at the end of the day, don't say that she has no ability to pay off anything. She does. So if she ends up forgiving the ksuba, let's deal with that when it happens. To which the Gemara says, Amri, kol legabe val, vaday machlele, va'af sedinu lahu zevina, be'adayim lo af sedinu. To which the Gemara says, say, you know what? It's almost guaranteed that she's going to be mochel the ksuba in this case. In this kind of case, and I will say, now again, in general, a woman's not mochel on a ksuba. She's not mochelas. But Allah Hamas in this kind of case, where she sold the ksuva to another party, the Gemara seems to feel it's almost a certainty that she is going to forgive the ksuva. So to create a transaction like this, where there's a sale of ksuva to another party, right, and it's almost guaranteed that she's going to be mochel this debt to her husband, it doesn't even make sense to me. It's wrong. It's wrong to even allow for such a transaction like this to occur. Zavina nehile lahu dechabla lebetavasana. Shabbos say, so why not do the following? See, Shabbos say, up until now, the way we've been floating the idea is, right, Rachel's married to Ruvain, she injures Shimon. So what we're saying, Rachel, go sell your ksuba to Levi, take the proceeds of that sale, and pay off Shimon. The Gemara says, why don't you structure it differently? Let her, watch this, let her, quote unquote, sell the ksuva to Shimon, the injured party. But obviously, what's going to happen over here? What's going to happen? There doesn't need to be an exchange of money. Rather, what she does is she'll essentially, quote unquote, sell the ksuva to Shimon, the injured party, for an amount commensurate with the damages. So essentially, what's going to happen over here is Shimon, the injured party, gets the rights to the ksuva. But again, no money has changed hands. But Shimon gets that right as a form of payment. So the beauty of that is essentially Shimon gets something. Again in lieu of damages. So let Rachel, quote unquote, sell. I'm using quote unquote sell because there's no exchange of money. Let her sell the ksuva, ultimately again to Shimon, the injured party, as a form of compensation for damages. Amud Beis, di'i machla legabe baal lo kamaf sedina. So let's say, what's the worst case scenario? What's the worst case scenario that happens over here? Worst case scenario is if she ends up forgiving the ksuva, fine. Shimon's no worse off than he was before, right? In other words, he wasn't getting paid money from her for damages anyway. So now at least he has the potential for the future collection of the ksuva. If she ends up forgiving it, she ends up forgiving it. But if she doesn't end up forgiving it, at least he has a future right of compensation. So at the end of the day, he's not getting paid now regardless, right? He's not getting any money. So if he's not getting any money, at least he has the potential for collection from the future ksuva. Sof, kol lagabe ba vaday machla, vatruche beidina bichdela matrachinan. So let's say no, the reason we don't like this is because, once again, it's almost positive, almost for sure, that she is going to be mochel this ksuva. So because she's going to be mochel this ksuva, Rabosai, this essentially becomes almost like a fictional transaction. And we don't really want to set up a fictional transaction because halacha l'maisa, you're going to cause now Shimon, the damaged party, to have to go to Beis Din to try to collect on something that's not really going to be collectible. Okay. But that which we learned, so listen to this case. What happens if Rachel injured her husband? Right? Rachel injured her husband, Ruvain. Ultimately, again, she doesn't lose her ksuva. So the Gemara says, I don't understand, Amai, tizabena nehili l'ksuvasa l'bayla b'tova sana, b'ha chavala, di'imachla l'gabe bayla leka psida. So Rabbi say, but one second, if a woman injures her husband, Rabbi say, oh, so now I have a very good solution. What's the solution? Let her give her husband the future right of her ksuva. Why Rabbi say? Because in this case, everyone should agree it could work. Why? Both say the only thing preventing us from using ksuva, future ksuva, or future right, is the fear of what? Being mochel the ksuva to her husband. In this case, let her be mochel. Right? That's fine. Because halacha l'maisa, again, whether she's not mochel or she is mochel, husband is going to benefit by not having to pay the ksuva to his wife. And that's ultimately a form of repayment. To which the Gemara says, Havad Rabbi Meir. Once again, Rabbi says, it's reflexive of Rabbi Meir. What does Rabbi Meir say? The Amar, Astra li Adam sheyashes ishta filu sha'achas below ksuva. Rabbi say, so here we run into this problem, right? If a wife gives her husband her ksuva, essentially as the form of repayment for damages, right? Future right to that ksuva, then Rabbi say, that's a problem. Why? Because now effectively, that couple is living without a ksuva. Living without a ksuva. And Rabbi Meir says that a couple can't live without a ksuva. Why not? Ultimately, Rabbi say because again, without a ksuva, there's no financial deterrent to divorce, and he could easily, flippantly, go ahead and divorce her. To which the Gemara says, "Hacha megarishla v'gabe lebechavle mina." I will say in this case over here, he could divorce her, because if he divorces her, again, quote unquote, he has the ability to collect her ksuva, ultimately as a form of repayment for damages. To which the Gemara says, Ihachi, hashtanami megarishla v'gabe lebechavle mina. So we'll say, so what's going on over here? Kigon, the nafish ksuvasa. To which the Gemara says, no, maybe the case where we'll say is where she has a very large ksuva. So we'll say, so for example, let's say, for argument's sake, her ksuva is $100,000. But the amount of damages that she owes him is $5,000. So we'll say, so therefore again, there's much more for him to lose than for him to gain by divorcing her. The Gemara says, the mishumahu parta lo mafsid tuva. Was that he's not going to divorce her, right? He's not going to divorce her in order to collect a relatively small amount of the ksuva, when he's going to have to end up paying a much larger amount for a divorce settlement. miksuvasa daraisa. So we'll say, but if we're talking about a case where her ksuva is larger than what we'll call the basic biblical ksuva, nukma aksuvasa daraisa. So we'll say, let's go ahead and therefore establish the amount that she owes based on the ksuva daraisa. So establish halacha lemaisa, that particular amount, and therefore v'idach tizabena nehila bechavlei. Then I will say, this is actually very interesting. Then halacha lemaisa, go ahead and establish the ksuva amount, right? The ksuva daraisa amount, as the amount that she owes him, and let her sell the remaining. There's what the Gemara is now suggesting is something very interesting over here, about maybe the ability to kind of split the ksuva between an ikr ksuva and a tosefes ksuva, and let the ikr ksuva remain intact, and go ahead and sell the future right to the tosefes. Kigon, the lo nefisha ksuvasa and ksuvasa da'araisa. So I'll say, again, the Gemara now reverts back and says, no, what's the case? The case ultimately, again, is where her ksuva is not really much more than the ksuva da'araisa. Da'have chable arba zuze. I'll say, for example, we're talking about over here where, let's say, the damages is a relatively minimal amount of 4 zuzim. Mishum arba zuze lo mafsid esrim bechamisha. That ultimately, also because of a relatively small amount of damages, the husband is not going to go ahead and cause himself literally to lose or to have to pay a much larger amount of the ksuva. Kishim shelo timkar v'hi tachtov. Right? Ultimately, again, the same way. Kach lo timkar, kach lo tafsid v'hi tachtov. Right? Ultimately, we'll say the Gemara says the same way that halacha l'maisa, that she should not sell the ksuva while she's still living under him. So too, again, she should not go ahead and cause the ksuva to be lost. Kach lo tafsid v'hi tachtov. But sometimes we'll say there is a case where ultimately the ksuva could be lost. Whereas at v'hechi dami, kigon dinefisha ksuvasa miksuvasa da'araisa. Ultimately, we'll say, what case would that be? That would be the case where the ksuva itself is worth more than a basic ksuva da'araisa. Our Rava said, Seifa asan luksuvas b'nedichin. Okay, we'll say, so now, there's a lot being thrown at us today, right? So we'll say, so here we go. What's the case over here? The case over here, ultimately, again, the case over here is where ksuvas b'nen dichrin. I will say a word about this very quickly. I know we'll have to stop over here for today. We'll pick up with this Rava today, ksuvas b'nen dichrin. But very quickly, we'll say, what's ksuvas b'nen dichrin? Ksuvas b'nen dichrin is the ability, ultimately, again, for a woman to say, my ksuva will always be inherited by my sons, and will not be part of any formal property distribution. So we'll pick up Emiras Hashem with this statement of Rava, but I will say, just fascinatingly enough, what we're trying to figure out over here, I will say, is, remember, now we've gone kind of from Takanas Usha to Kinyan Peiros, to Kinyan Guf, Lav, Kinyan Guf, and then I will say, focusing on the very interesting particular detail over here about the Mishnah telling me that if a married woman injures someone, really pigi asan ra, the injured party is at a disadvantage because halacha l'maisa, she has nothing to pay back with. We're just trying to figure out is why is that so? At the end of the day, there is a ksuva, and there is a future right to that ksuva. Why doesn't that represent the value, ultimately, again, that could be used for repayment? Now, obviously, I will say the concern is if it's to someone else, she could be mochel the ksuva. But the husband himself, it should work. Again, we'll resolve this in Emiras Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach.